Have you ever felt guilty about feeling embarrassed about being Catholic? Maybe you're in class, maybe with your group of friends, maybe with family, and somebody makes a comment that is disparaging to the church. And either you don't know how to respond, or you feel embarrassed and you just keep your mouth shut. And then afterwards, it's just like, why didn't I speak up? Or why didn't I speak up in a more effective way? Or maybe I even kind of share some of the objections that were being made. And so how do we manage this? How do we deal with this? And how do we grow in our love for the church? Today we're celebrating the feast of the dedication of the Basilica of St. John Lateran. Now you might not know this, but the Pope's Cathedral, the bishop's seat in Rome, is actually the Basilica of St. John Lateran. Now in passing, that's where I was ordained, so it's definitely one of my favorite churches in the world, but that's not what I want to focus on right now. What is kind of the deal with the Basilica of St. John Lateran? Well, first of all, there is no St. John Lateran, in the sense that there's not a saint whose last name is Lateran. It's named after John the Baptist, and there's even a little bit of connection or kind of spiritual heritage from John the Apostle. And why Lateran then? Well, that's the last name of the family of the land where it was donated, taken. Okay, so how does that happen? So we have to go all the way back to the 4th century. Now, a lot of us, we probably have heard the name Constantine, great emperor, the first Christian emperor, and he is the reason why we have the land that's now St. John Lateran Basilica. So what happens? The empire had grown so much that it had to divide just to be able to be administered effectively. And so you have kind of these two emperors, and they're fighting to see, well, who's going to be really in charge. So you have Maxentius, and then you have Constantine. So Constantine comes in, and his mother was a devout Christian, St. Helen, and so he knew a little bit about Christianity. And so the night before the battle of Milvian Bridge, he receives this vision, and he sees this cross in the sky, and this comes down to us in hoc signo vinces. Under this sign you will conquer. And so he has all of his soldiers paint the cross on their shields, and they go out into battle, and they have a resounding victory. And so one of the first things that he does, the Edict of Milan, is to make Christianity legal in the empire. And then he takes it a bit further, and so Maxentius I think it was his sister that was the one who kind of had this land, where now it's the Lateran Basilica. He takes that land and donates it to the church. And so Constantine becomes one of the great benefactors of the church. Now, historians can debate how good, how bad that was. But so today we're celebrating the dedication of the Basilica of St. John Lateran. And so it's a day for us to reflect on, what is a church building? Why do we have this? What does it mean for us? And so even the gospel that we hear today, well, what happens? It's Jesus who has this zeal for the house of his Father. So he comes in, he cleanses the temple because he doesn't want secular worldly things happening in the temple that he knows that is supposed to be a place of sacrifice to God, of prayer, of communion, but not a place of just everyday business affairs. Over the centuries, churches become more elaborate. In the very beginning days in Rome, it was mostly house churches. Then you finally start to have kind of some of these marketplaces being converted into churches. But over time, it becomes more and more elaborate. And so we too can feel a certain zeal for making sure that the church is a beautiful place and making sure that we are dedicating ourselves to the church in a good way. And this doesn't refer simply to the physical buildings, because the church is much more than that. And much more important is the community that is formed there. St. Lawrence, one of the first deacons of Rome, famously, when the emperor asked him to give over the treasures of the church, well, he gathered the poor together and presented them to the emperor, to the city officials. And I don't think they were too impressed by that. In fact, they burned him alive. So maybe not the way to answer in the moment, at least not for his permanent health. But it shows something that's very true, that the true treasures of the church are it's people. We show our zeal for God, for God's presence in the world, when we give witness to who we are as Christians. We hear in the first letter of St. Paul that we are God's building. And this reminds me of something that Pope Leo said recently, where he reminded us to contemplate and rediscover the mystery of the church. She is not merely a religious institution, nor is she simply identified with its hierarchies and structures. We do a disservice to the church when we think of it as simply an external organization, as merely a building or as merely a set of rules and regulations, a bureaucracy. It's the living body of Christ, and we form part in the church through our baptism. And now we have to see, what do we do? How do our actions affect the church? We can either build up the church through our faith and our action, or we can tear her down through destructive comments and making the gospel political rather than evangelical. Paul reminds the Corinthians that he built them up by laying a foundation, but that others would continue the process of building. And so this is something we see as well, that the faith is something that's handed down to us from former generations all the way back to the apostles, but that each generation we have the responsibility to continue building on the foundation that has been given to us. And this is something that really makes me passionate, that we are able to collaborate, to work with God in the world, and that it's up to us. And very much, up to the laity. And this is something that comes out in the documents from the Second Vatican Council, that obviously priests and religious have a role to play in the church, but it's really the laity, so all of you that are called to bring the message of the gospel out into the world, into your classrooms, into your places of work, into your group of friends. You are meant to be missionaries. This is part of what it means to be Christian. This is part of what it means to be Catholic. And so are you living up to that missionary goal, that zeal that Christ wants to put in your heart? You are God's building. According to the grace of God given to me, like a master builder, I laid a foundation and another is building upon it. And so that's Paul speaking to the Corinthians, but it's Paul speaking to each one of us and making sure that we continue to grow, to know our faith more deeply, and to correspond to it in our life, in our action. The church is where God intends to bring us all together into one family of brothers and sisters and make us his people, a people made up of beloved children, all united in the embrace of his love. Building up the church is not a self-serving prospect, right? It's not just we want to be a lot of people, and so we invite more people into the church. We know that the church is a sacrament of salvation, that the church is the way that people get to heaven. And so that's why we invite people to join the church. That's why we want to bring people in. That's why we want to share the beauty, the wonderful, wonderful beauty of the gospel. Think, when is the last time that you shared the gospel with somebody else? This is who we are called to be as Christians. Each one must be careful how he builds upon it, for no one can lay a foundation other than the one that is there, namely Jesus Christ. So this isn't the church instead of Jesus. This isn't Mary instead of Jesus. This isn't the Pope instead of Jesus. All of these means that God has given to us allow us to enter into a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. And that's what we're seeking. And it's so beautiful. It's so present in the Mass. What's the central point of the Mass? The consecration of the Eucharist, where the priest takes a piece of bread, a little bit of wine, says the words, and then all of a sudden it's Jesus on the altar. It's a miracle that we celebrate every time that we come together and have the sacrifice of the Mass. Social pressures can lead us to hide our faith, to politicize the faith, or to make jokes at the expense of the church. But this is not what a Catholic does. We want to give witness to faith and do not want to make comments that tear down the faith, that tear down the church. We can't tear down the church, because to do so would be to tear down ourselves. We are part of the church. We shouldn't say the church as if it's something completely removed from us. What the Pope, what the bishops, what religious, what priests, what they say. We are the church in a very real way. But we're the church, and we're obedient to the tradition of the church. This week, take some time to speak to a friend about Christ, about the church. Be a builder, not a bystander. Be a cornerstone, not a critic.